nitrates. Tim, I'll hand over to you, just a brief intro. And then it's broken up to 3 sections. So after, I think Lisa's going to be first and there'll be questions. So presentation's going to happen all the way through. Listen, questions, presentation, questions, presentation, questions. Ka pai whānau? So no, you can put your hand up, I'll write your name, but write your own questions down while we're going through the presentations. Over to you, Tim.
Kia ora, Chair, and kia ora, councillors. So look, this is the second of the briefings that in and around nitrate issues coming from the notice of motion in the last session around nitrate. And so last week we were talking a bit about, what nitrate is, where it comes from, a little bit about what can be done on it. And today we've got, it is 3 parts. The first part is Lisa. So do I need to introduce you?
I introduced myself yesterday.
You introduced yourself, yes. Great, Lisa. That's great. Is Lisa, who will be talking about the planning response and what we've done in a planning framework and how that has been done. And then Cam Smith is going to be talking a little bit about the nitrate action plan that has been put in place in response to the nitrate emergency. And then we're going to be picking up and talking about lags, in particular, nitrate lags, which is a key issue to understand. And Fiona and myself, but also he will join the front row soon, is Professor Rich McDowell from Lincoln University, who will also be helping in that presentation. So I'll hand straight on to Lisa.
Thank you, Tim, and kia ora, councillors. Maybe go to the next slide. So the previous council approved a notice of motion that called for increased leadership, sharing of knowledge and looking for solutions regarding nitrate pollution in groundwater and drinking water in Canterbury. Staff are actioning that notice of motion, and today is an overview of the things that we do to manage nitrates in Canterbury. In this first session, I'm just going to cover the regulatory planning system and how it was developed and what it does and doesn't do in relation to managing nitrates in water. So we have a number of functions, powers and duties under the RMA currently, to TBC in the future. With regard to Environment Canterbury's role, it includes management of discharges of contaminants which may enter water, management of water takes, and management of the cumulative impacts of land use on water quality. Territorial authorities also have a role in managing land use development and infrastructure, and that also impacts those cumulative impacts on water quality. And then Taumata Arawai have functions under different legislation, and that's for regulating drinking water suppliers. We've recently published on the website a full history of RMA planning in Waitaha, and it's quite a long web page. But I really encourage you to go and have a look at it. And I think if you've got a PDF, then the link should work from your laptop. That website really tells that long and twisted tale of how we've developed a plan framework, which is sort of currently nationally leading, and it's it's come through with a lot of sort of knowledge and trial and error over the years. The first regional plans developed really slowly. They took around 20 years for the Natural Resources Regional Plan to become fully operative. The initial focus of the Natural Resources Regional Plan was on water quantity and managing allocation, and that was in a system where it was very much a first come, first served basis, and there weren't a lot of limits in place for water takes. But while that was sort of developing, there was land use intensification and change happening across most of Canterbury. that added to the complexity of the regulatory development. There were difficulties in decision making, and the pace of change in the degrading environment led Environment Canterbury and the mayors and our partners, our Runanga partners, to develop the Canterbury Water Management Strategy. The Canterbury Water Management Strategy set up a collaborative approach to managing water quality and quantity issues within Canterbury. It set up joint committees of territorial authorities, the regional council, and then appointed members from Runanga and from the community, who were tasked with developing at a catchment scale solutions for maintaining or improving water quality and quantity within their zones. Those zone committees relied on the best information that was available, and they didn't wait around for the science to become perfect. But as we went through each process with each zone committee, the science did become much more sophisticated. There was a zone-based approach to agreeing outcomes and setting limits and targets for achieving those outcomes. And it was predicated on the principle of consensus. So the zone committees really tried hard to reach consensus around the table, and they accepted within that a need for gifting and gaining. So those zone committees really worked hard to make those hard choices and figure out whether the gains were and where the gifts were. There were expectations of outcomes being achieved over differing timeframes across the region, and in some cases, the expectations of those outcomes being achieved were over generations, and not just over people generations, but also over generations of plans. But just back to that point about the science getting more sophisticated with each sub-regional process, the same goes for the plan framework. That got much more sophisticated with each process. The region-wide provisions that we started with when the Land and Water Plan was notified, I think that was in 2009, but my memory's getting a bit sketchy there. That set the direction, and it started the integration of water quality and quantity management, but it also introduced some land use controls and the concept of managing farming land use as a thing to manage cumulative impacts. Plan changes 1 and 2 developed the concept of good management practices and nitrogen loss rates for land users. And it also developed the concept of having a baseline of nitrogen losses to measure against. Plan change 3 then introduced a more flexible framework that allowed for intensification within certain conditions. And plan changes 2 and 3 both introduced catchment scale mitigations to support the GMPs and the other reduction activities that land users were undertaking. Plan change 5 came along and standardised the way that we calculate baseline loss rates. So that's how much nitrogen or how much nutrient can a property lose in a given year or leach in a given year. And then it moved the entire region to a hold the line approach. So it made sure that intensification didn't bring further nitrogen losses with it. Plan change 6 looked much more closely at phosphorus management, and it addresses issues of poor or broken infrastructure and vegetation management. And then plan change 7 identified and targeted risk areas and found bespoke solutions for specific areas that were under particular pressure in Waimakariri and OTOP. So all of that is kind of built up to quite a complex layered plan framework. Within that plan framework, there's different limits, and they're looking for different outcomes, or they're there to support different outcomes. So we have drinking water guideline limits in some sub-regionals, and we have MAV or half MAV limits, and they apply to drinking water protection zones, or in some instances to groundwater allocation zones. Where they apply to drinking water protection zones, they're really there to protect community water supply. Where they're applying to groundwater allocation zones, they're there to protect private water supply. We've also got toxicity limits that are set in many surface water bodies for ecosystem health protection. With trophic level index limits set to maintain and improve ecosystem and habitat health, and particularly in lakes. We have catchment and farm load limits, or output controls, that are set for the cumulative impacts and managing those cumulative impacts. And then we have water quantity limits and augmentation, and we also enable augmentation, and that provides for water quality outcomes because it provides for flushing and dilution of nutrients through the system. So in that big complex plan framework, we've got a lot of rules, and the rules do lots of different things. We have point source discharge management rules, and they manage the pipes that go directly onto land or into water. So that's things like municipal wastewater, effluent, stormwater industry. We have rules that require establishment of baseline nutrient losses. So, how much nitrogen were you losing in this period? Please hold to that line. That's what those rules do. We require people to hold at baseline losses, and that's sometimes referred to as grandparenting. We have rules that require good management practices and advanced mitigations. So good management practices are kind of minimum good practice for all landowners. And then we have advanced mitigation, so where we need to reduce further than GMP rates, we ask for further mitigations. Some catchments have actions that switch on or off depending on certain environmental limits being met, or if certain environmental limits are breached, or if actions are completed or not. So, for example, in the Huronui and Waia plan, there's a 10% rule, and that triggers restrictions on what farmers can do depending on whether or not the concentrations of phosphorus in the Huronui River exceed a certain amount over a 6-year rolling time frame. In south coastal Canterbury, the ability to intensify is dependent on if augmentation occurs with water coming in from outside of the catchment. And that was something that Henry referred to yesterday with the Hunter Downs scheme. So that's an ability that's there within the plan, but because that scheme hasn't gone ahead and the augmentation hasn't occurred, then the intensification also can't occur. And finally, we've got rule requirements. All of these rule requirements are delivered through consenting, through farm environment planning and auditing, but also through a lot of the outreach work that we do. So the next few slides just sort of are a bit of an example of what we expect to see coming out of the plan framework. And what we expect to see is different in different catchments, but these were based on that CWMS sort of gifting and gaining approach. So you can see here in Sau and Te Waihora, we're expecting between 2010 and 2035 that nitrogen concentrations in groundwater will increase from sort of just under 7 milligrams per litre to about 8.5 milligrams per litre. And the flip side of that of that increase in nitrogen is that we would also see a reduction in sediment and runoff and a number of other actions that would improve the health of Te Waihora. Here in Hekio Hines, we're expecting quite a significant drop-off in the concentrations of nitrogen in groundwater. So from 2015 to 2035, we expect it to go from a concentration of 9.4 milligrams per litre down to 6.9 milligrams per litre, which is around half the drinking water standard or guideline, the top of the guideline. And then in the Twizel Basin in the Waitaki, we're actually expecting that nitrogen levels will remain the same at 1.6 milligrams per litre. And that's just a reflection of that maintain or improve approach where the environment was in a good state, we seek to maintain that. So the work that's underway currently in the planning space is an evaluation of that plan framework that I just sort of walked through and the effectiveness and efficiency of the rules. You'll see that work early next year. What we expect it to tell us is if those outcomes that we're expecting are being met and whether or not that's because of what we're doing in the rule implementation space. And it will also tell us whether or not we're putting our effort into the right things. This is foundational work, and it will determine what we need to focus on in the next round of planning. So this afternoon, Sam and Fiona are going to talk about what's next outside of the plan framework. But in the meantime, the planning section is just going to keep working on, concentrating on that foundational work that's underway and sort of thinking about how we can respond to that as the resource management system changes over the next few months and years. And we're also just, really making sure that we are putting effort into the things that are going to get those outcomes on the ground. Sorry, and I've just lost my place in my notes, which is why I've gone a little bit. Okay. Finally, there's a paper that's coming on the 10th of December, and that paper will just have some noting actions for the council, and it's on the three parts of the notice of motion, so it's just to acknowledge that those actions are being taken. That's the end of my presentation, so I'll stop for questions.
Kia ora, any questions? John was first, and then Megan. Yeah.
No, if I could just probably provide a little bit more of the historical context in the Hurunu-Waia regional zone. We were the first cab off the rank, and I know there's been a lot of commentary that the zone committee process was ineffective, but when we started the process, it was focused on storage. We had about 54 dam sites presented to us, and I don't think if you went up to the Hurunui you'd find any of them in action at the moment. The only one that's on the horizon is a 10 million cubic metre storage pond from AIC. Early on in the process, we also had identification of probably 100,000 hectares that was available to be irrigated in the Hurunui district, and everybody got all excited about that. There was two work streams. One was on storage, and I missed out on that because it was not the sexy one, and I got dropped into land use and water quality, and it became pretty quickly apparent that there were constraints, and what Lisa was heavily involved in that, and Tim was heavily involved, and we did a lot of really, really good work. So what I'm essentially saying is that whilst there is a lot of angst out there towards the zone committee process and farmers, the Canterbury water management process system, especially in the Hurunui, was really effective in limiting intensification. The 10% rule, that was one of our little faux pas, but that was resolved through a really, really vigorous science-based process. And I think that we need to be cognizant of the fact that there is a lot of successes lying behind these issues as well as problems.
So no question there, John? Megan?
Kia ora. My question, and I hope it's not a stupid question, but I don't understand it, so I'm just going to ask it. So on slide 11, you showed Waitaki. You said the planning framework, or this is my understanding, planning framework is designed to keep the nitrogen level the same the whole way through. But what is the planning for the two slides before it? What is the planning framework trying to do to have one go up and one go down?
Kia ora, Megan, and it's an excellent question, and it was something that I was just thinking about, of adding a little bit more context around some of these things. So forgive me, I'll just go a few steps back and then I'll try and answer your question directly. The first thing is that in the Canterbury Water Management Strategy, one of the key objectives was to set water quality limits. Now, that was not in a national policy statement for freshwater at the time. It was the first time in New Zealand that it was a strategy. It wasn't a legal document as such, but where there was an aim to set water quality limits. Following that, about 2 years afterwards, the national policy, I can't remember which national policy statement it was, but the national policy statement for freshwater management then set out that water quality limits needed to be set nationwide. Now, it's really important this about the changing of the national policy statement for freshwater management, the different ones that came in, and I can't quote them all off the top of my head, but they had differing things that they were allowing. And the very first one, which was at the time that John was talking about, the Hurunui plan, it allowed for unders and overs within an area. So it talked about water quality staying the same, but you could essentially do a sort of a trade-off almost of saying, well, we'll let this one go up and this one down within the zone when overall it's going to stay the same. So that was in the first national policy statement for freshwater management. The next one that came through said, what's the official word? No more decline.
Maintain or improve.
Maintain and improve, sorry. Yes, of course it is. Maintain and improve, which is saying that you cannot... yes, but it allowed it to do it within. This is actually saying everywhere had to be maintained and improved in the second one. Now, that sets a slightly different framework for when you're... And all the time, we were doing plan changes amongst these different changes. And then the policy framework was changing nationally as well and setting different limits. But if I come to this one, which is what... Not this one. This one, which is what you were asking about for Selwyn Te Wahora. This is where it does get rather complicated, because contrary to what you're seeing, that is an improvement. And contrary to what is at all intuitive, the reason being, though, that the figure you see for 2010, the under 7, is what we were observing in 2010, and the average water quality was about 6.8 or something. I can't remember, something around there. But there was already authorised through Central Plains Water Limited an increasing load. Now, when you're in a planning framework, if it's authorised, that is part of the natural environment. That is part of the environment. So actually, although we were observing it at 7, if you modelled it through for what had been authorised, it was higher, and I can't remember what the figure is. So that getting it to 8.5 did involve actually bringing it down, even though it looks like it's allowing it to go up. So that's how it looks, and it's sort of counterintuitive to how that appears there, which looks like you're allowing an increase. Actually, it's a decrease on what was already authorised. So in order to get to 8.5, there have to be rules in there, for example, in Sal and Waihora, that all dairy farming has to go 30% beyond good management practice in terms of nitrate leaching to reduce the amount down.
Just one follow up on that then, just so to make sure I've got it. So 6.8 is not right because that didn't take into account the consented approvals. So do we know what the natural plus consented would have been so that we know what the actual drop was, or has that not been modelled?
Through you, Chair, I think we did at the time. I just can't remember it off the top of my head. We had modelled it so that it was showing a reduction. I just don't remember what that figure was. I can find it. It would be on the record.
Ashley.
For us newbies in the room, can you please explain 10% rules? What does it mean?
Okay, that's going to dredge the memory banks a little bit. The 10% rule currently exists in the Hiranui Waia plan. It's a specific rule, but it includes a definition and a policy. But it basically says that to be a permitted activity, you can't in any given year change by a magnitude of more than 10% from your baseline load.
And perhaps
So,
I'll just add one thing on that. Where this got difficult was that makes really good sense. Well, I shouldn't say it makes really good. It's understandable if you're a dairy farm. If you're a hill country farm and you've got a very low loss, forgive my French, but 10% of bugger all is bugger all. So it's, you're talking about, so where that got difficult was that hill country farming, who might be talking about doing a really small increase through, increased forage crops or something like that, would exceed their 10% because they had such a small amount anyway. And that this is where it got difficult amongst the community.
sorry. Are we talking about no more than 10% increase in nitrogen loss, or is it 10% of what?
I'll try this. When we were setting up our plan, we wanted to place restrictions on intensification, and it was specifically dairy-based. So, as Tim said, 10% in a dairy situation where it was 100,000 for round numbers, that's 10 kilograms of N. But if you're in a dryland situation, and you can easily get into, Hiranui had a 3-year drought, so you reduce your stocking numbers dramatically. And then when the drought breaks and you start increasing again, you get into a situation where you're immediately in breach of the rules. And we hadn't considered that at all.
Still not 100% clear. What does the 10% apply to? Is it stock numbers? Is it nitrogen? Is it anything and everything?
It's 10% of the nitrate leaching.
It was based on the assimilative ability of the Hiranui to take the extra flux and nutrients and stay within the first MPS for freshwaters guidelines, which is maintain and improve. So it was all based on a catchment model of what the catchment could take, and therefore what could be allowed to happen within the catchment, if that helps.
Good, Ashley. Good question. Nick?
Thank you. So 3 points. Thanks, John Faulkner, for sharing some of your experiences on that zone committee. Really nice to hear about some of the outcomes there. When things don't happen, there's nothing to see. So it's easy to think nothing's been achieved potentially, but that's really helpul. So thanks for sharing that. I guess why you'll hear skepticism about CWMS, zone committees, catchment groups. From me, at least, is because both economists and social scientists agree that the smaller the unit of land management, then the more likely landowners are willing to intensify and turn that land use to industry or business, because it's one's own business and backyard. And the bigger the land area, then the more push there is for a healthy environment, as well as intensification. And we see that across Canterbury, where for rural land owners, feel unhappy because townies want it to be kept for conservation, whereas if it's just up to them, it would be more industry based. So that's the scale question. But really useful to hear about some great outcomes there. So thank you for sharing. I didn't know that. Number 2 point, to come to Megan's questions about Waitaki, and looking at that graph there on the slide 11 about what we expect to see in the Waitaki Basin. I find these graphs with a projection but no line showing the actuals quite concerning and very pie in the sky. So I would request, for future ones, a line of a projection. And given this goes back to the past, a decade ago, presumably we have the numbers, and a line showing the actuals. And I remember from our chair sharing a post recently from ECAN about the Waitaki, about the most recent monitoring of the water bodies, the lakes, and they were around the 3.4s and things. I remember thinking, yep, they're trending up as we'd expect with intensified land use. So, there's a dichotomy there for me, or a dissonance between reality and this line. And point number 3, my own point, is later in the presentation, I can see here at slide 12, evaluation of effectiveness and efficiency of rules. And that sounds great. Really look forward to that, of course, because it's all well and good for us to make plans and draw lines out into the future. And as we should, we need to look ahead. But we've been doing this for a long time. And so we did this at the start of the CWNS, right? 2010, we drew lines out into the future and we said we do this and we do that. And I'm sure in this organisation, the work has been done to see whether what happened matched what we predicted, and there'll be learnings from that. And so let's have that shared back to us. It's something I asked for in another session as well, because we need to learn from our experiences. And without looking at how we did in the past, our work to plan success in the future will be weak, and as a governor, need that information to make the right, good decisions. So, thank you.
Nick, thanks for that. I probably had, I was looking at those graphs and thinking if we could, they were 2010 to I think 2030, it's 2025, actually see where actual is. I don't know if we can do that. Can we do that, Lisa?
To be honest, those graphs were drawn by a planner, and we were a little bit wary of putting some scientific lines on there. But there are lines. We do our state of the environment monitoring. There are lines, but what can kind of be pulled as a trend, I think we need a bit of a science lens over that, and I'm sure Tim can.
We can show data as to what the current state is. Which you just got to be a little bit. I just sort of hold back a little bit in saying that's modelled as an average, and it's not an instant thing to be able to come up with an average. So it would take a little while to pull together the data. But we have data that could show what it's been doing since then.
Good, thanks, Tim. Sarah and Andrea.
Thank you, Chair. Back to the slide for functions, powers and duties. Our role shouldn't it not, include the management of our freshwater, aquifer and river ecosystems as well?
It does, but we do that by managing the water quality and quantity within those ecosystems.
However, when we look at those graphs, those loadings of nitrogen are way beyond what freshwater ecosystems would be healthy. So, yeah, are we monitoring those, and is it part of this work?
Yes, we're monitoring. I guess the limits and targets that were set through the CWMS were, as I said, were set for a number of different outcomes, but ecosystem health was one of them. And yeah, I mean, I'm not gonna, I'm not an ecologist, so I'm not gonna talk. I don't know kind of what's healthy in an ecosystem or not, but I think they would have been modelled on what the assimilative capacity of the environment was, and what it was sort of considered you'd get the right outcomes from an ecological sense as well as from
Can I just perhaps go back to the previous briefing? And I remember somewhere in it there was a line that said something along the lines of, nitrate is not the only thing that controls the ecology of a stream or the health of an aquatic environment. So just to do it off a single figure of nitrate can be quite misleading, because there are other things that need to be taken into account.
Supplementary, yes, I understand that, but I'll bring this, go back into the room. Yeah, we need to know this crustacean and the bacteria, the protozoa, they eat off that they eat are all part of an ecosystem that treat our water. So all the nitrates that are going down into the aquifer, along with organic matter or whatever, get cleaned up by the bacteria, protozoa, and this. I mean, so it's all part of an ecosystem that's really fragile that we need to know about. And so I just want it to be part of the discussion and part of what we do.
I understand completely what your point is. Somewhere in here, and I saw it, there was Lisa made a reference to working with the science that we have. And the reality is that there is a very, very poor understanding of the impact of nitrate on stygofauna, which is what you've shown there. So it's something that is really poorly understood. What we have worked from is and you may recall it from the previous briefing, the understanding of the impact of nitrate on different species, freshwater species, and that includes invertebrates, but not necessarily groundwater invertebrates. So there's a kind of assumption that there will be a similar, so that when I talked about the 99% of species are protected at a certain concentration, and 95, 90, 80%, that it would be similar for stygofauna. But that's unknown. And I mean, I guess it's one of those things that as a regional council, we have been trying to get that research done. It's very expensive. We can't do it ourselves, and therefore, we have tried to get it done through MB-funded projects and things like that. So,
So at the conference this week, the freshwater one, there was some scientists there from talking about the environment. What was it? Public health environment. And anyway, they were talking. So they are doing science on the bacteria, protozoa, and fauna, and I just think there should be more. I mean, they're the ones that know about the Canterbury aquifers better than anybody at the moment, and I'm just sort of thinking, well, they should be part of in-house almost. So yeah, it seems we haven't got enough links with the science that is there. Yeah. Anyway, just a comment. So thank you.
I mean, if I could just quickly comment on that. So what you're referring to is the what was formerly ESR, and are now the whatever they are, PRO, the public PHS, yes, F. Look, we have excellent contacts in with PHF, and we do a lot of work together. We encourage a lot of their work, as we do with other PROs. So it's a really important part of our science function, is that we're linking in with other research organisations that are doing this type of work. So please don't take it that we only listen to the scientists in-house. It's a key part of our work as scientists in Environment Canterbury, is linking in with other institutes who are doing this type of work.
And that's why we have Prof sitting in the back, right?
Yeah.
Actually, same topic or a different topic? Oh, okay, no, I'm going over to Andrea. Sorry.
Everyone looks that way. Wait, okay. Planning. Okay, Lisa. So the planning framework, and I've talked to some of the colleagues here from farming, and I'm reading through PC 1, 2, and 3 and stuff at the moment, and just thinking about going forward and communicating these things with the public. Can you see a time when we don't have different limits and different rules for different parts of Canterbury? Like, why does, PC1 and PC2 have quite different things? So can you see a time when we okay.
Yes, that is my favourite topic. Not necessarily standard limits and targets, because those things are, they've got to be sort of locally set to those local environments. But when it comes to rule duplication and 3 different types of GMP and that sort of thing, then absolutely, that is really what I'm focusing on right now, is really reducing the complexity and the duplication within our plan framework, so that we don't have 700 rules that are really hard to understand. Yeah.
Kia ora, Ian, same topic? Or, nah, same topic?
Suddenly, in your answer to Andrew was, so are you worried about the outcomes, having similar outcomes or similar rules?
I'm worried about the complexity of it and the way it looks to the public.
The scope of the MPS was about collaborative processes, and it was about setting bottom line limits and then maintain and improve. They were the 2 critical things. But it was up to the communities to decide how aspirational they wanted to be. So you're always going to have different outcomes for different waterways across Canterbury. But that wasn't your concern. You're happy with that? Okay, sorry. Cool.
Kapai. Kia ora, Claire.
Mine goes back to the comment that Sarah was digging into, and I'm sure, Tim, you were on the trip where we went to Silverstream. But the Silverstream springhead and the start of that river is one of the highest nitrate rivers, spring-fed rivers in Canterbury, and it actually, I understand it's got one of the highest MICs as well, and MCIs, yeah, sorry, MCIs, and also ESR when it was ESR, Lee Burberry and Murray Close did quite a bit of work there. And the day that we visited, I can remember the ends were quite high, nitrate was quite high at the input, and he actually collected some samples and had styrofoam in bottles. So they were living quite successfully. Well, perhaps I could pull that back. That's probably not appropriate, but there were organisms present, and they were live at that time. As to the numbers, whether that was normal or not, I don't know. But yeah, so it can be. But whether there was, that is an ongoing trial still, I think, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes, so what Councillor Mackay is referring to is Silver Stream, and there are two Silver Streams in Canterbury, which makes it confusing, but this is in North Canterbury, just near Kaiapoi. And there is some work that's being done around a denitrification wall, and that's putting in intercepting groundwater as it's moving towards the Silver Stream, and with wood chips, and you get a reducing environment, and you denitrify the water, and it's shown quite remarkable denitrification beyond it. So it was an experiment done to show that this type of thing can be done, and as Claire was referring to, they've done all sorts of work around it, including looking at the stygofauna and what concentrations there are, and all sorts of things around that.
Kia ora tātou, great questions, and thanks, Lisa, for that and bringing that to us. We're going to move on. I think it's over to you, is it, Cam? Or...
We'll just go straight in today on here.
Excellent, thank you, and good afternoon. I have a few slides here before I'll hand over to my science colleagues, and largely just talk about a little bit of work that is very much the here and now. Lisa talked to the planning framework that we have in place, and there's obviously kind of compliance work associated with that, but we've also got some other work underway that I would like to bring to you today. But just firstly, you saw this diagram last week, I understand, just outlining roles and responsibilities, particularly with regard to drinking water. And so it outlines the roles that Environment Canterbury has to play. Lisa talked to that, also around territorial authorities and their responsibility for safe drinking water delivery, particularly community drinking water supplies. And it also importantly talks to the work of Taumata Arawai up in the top right there, and that's the New Zealand Drinking Water Authority, and they set standards for suppliers. And just understanding some of those drinking water roles and responsibilities is really important for the next few slides that I will talk to. So we have a drinking water action plan in place, and this plan is focused on supporting drinking water outcomes in the short term, and it's important for both community supplies and domestic self-supplies. However, it is weighted towards domestic self-supplies, and I just want to pause there because I'm likely to say domestic self-supplies a few times, so I want to make sure you understand what that means. And so domestic self-supplies has a particular meaning under the Water Services Act, and domestic self-supplies are seen as households or dwellings serving less than 26 people. So that's important. So we're talking about households, essentially, households. And so households on their own form of drinking water. So it's not community supplied, it's not supplied by a council. They have their own well supplying their own water. And so we have a drinking water action plan that talks to both community and domestic, but particularly focused on these households. And I'll talk through the various stages that we're running through here. However, we have a focus on these households because the scale of the issue is less understood. And here I'm talking about nitrate contamination in the drinking water within these households. So the scale of the issue is less understood, and there are less or no regulatory backstops in place for these supplies. So under water services legislation for community supplies, there are requirements for registering, there are requirements for monitoring, for testing, and for treating that water. For these households on their own water source, there are none of those requirements. So that's what I mean by there are no regulatory backstops in place for these suppliers. We aren't required to do anything for these particular households, neither are those territorial authorities. And the role, there's Taumata Arawai, the Water Services Authority, doesn't have much of a role there either. They have one role that was introduced into the legislation in August of this year, and that was around creating awareness, education, and things like that, but no full regulatory requirements. So the components of the plan that I'll talk through, we're engaging with the key agencies that I've outlined, so Taumata Arawai, the local councils, and also the Medical Officer of Health, because they are the best people to talk to the public health risks of nitrate contamination in water. So the plan has three key phases, which I'll talk through, and sits importantly alongside our ongoing communications work that we do at the regional level with regard to making people aware of the drinking water requirements or the kind of ability to test, etc., and also our compliance work. And so there's a lot of compliance work associated with drinking water, but particularly on community supplies. And you might remember from last month's quarterly core service performance reporting, we have activities within drinking water protection zones as a key compliance focus for us, in which we have established a baseline of reporting on compliance status within those for those activities. And obviously this sits alongside much of the science work that we've already touched on. Next. So the Drinking Water Action Plan has three key phases. The first phase is really strengthening our knowledge and data collection, and there's two key components to this work. So I talked about some of the information gaps in the space, given that it falls outside of anyone's true responsibility. So we've contacted a third party to understand how many domestic self-supplies there are in Canterbury and the general location of these. And so we're looking across Canterbury to understand how many people are relying on their own drinking water. Within our science section, we're also updating our risk maps of nitrate in Canterbury groundwater. So that's something that we do on a regular basis, and that's going to improve our spatial understanding of the risk of nitrate contamination in groundwater used for drinking. So those are two important pieces, but the kind of the richness comes when we add these two pieces together. So these are going to give us, when we put these together, give us an understanding of how many domestic self-supplies in Canterbury are in moderate to high-risk areas, and the general location of these supplies. And so that's information we don't currently have. That's information that no one currently has, and that's what we're putting together through this bit of work. Phase two. So once we have that information, we're then looking to undertake some targeted engagement with households. And so, again, two key components will be delivered early next year. We're going to be contacting domestic self-supplies in those moderate to high-risk areas to kind of outline the risks, steps they can take to treat drinking water, and where to get further information. That sits alongside much of the regional communications we've done and continue to do across Canterbury, but that's more via social media, etc. It's not necessarily targeted to particular areas. We'll then also be looking to survey domestic self-supplies to understand how many have maintained treatment systems in place. Because what we do know is that households that have treatment systems in place and are maintaining them correctly, it does a really good job at reducing kind of contaminants in that water. You know, if you're thinking about nitrate, it can reduce it by between 70 to 90%. So treatment systems for those places are really important. And the Medical Officer of Health would say if you're relying on your own water anywhere in Canterbury, you probably want to be treating it to some degree. So that's what we'll be looking to find out from that. And so, again, when we have these bits of information, it's really important because that's going to both raise awareness, and we can have an understanding of the scale of how many people are out there are treating or not treating, how many are maintaining, and that's going to inform options for facilitating uptake of treatment systems. And this is where some of this work really talks to the notice of motion that was passed by Council at the last Council at its September meeting. Next slide, please. So then we move into phase three, and so this will be initiated after that engagement early next year. And so there's three key components to this. And so the first one is identifying tools that are most effective at increasing treatment uptake in these particular areas. And people often will leap to do they need funding support? But we also want to understand what role does awareness play, and if you actually make people more aware, sometimes they'll be more likely to take action. So we're going to be looking at the tools that are most effective there. We'll also be looking at the household, local or regional costs of those tools, whether it be awareness or whether it be funding support, looking at the cost of in-home treatment systems. And just for information, at-home treatment systems cost around about $1,500. And then on an annual basis, there's $200 or $300 of maintaining. There will then be looking at early next year as well, identifying and assessing possible funding pathways for what tools, for possible tools. And so obviously there's regional versus targeted rates, looking at external sources. And then this is going to inform recommendations for council, and this really is talking to the third component of that notice of motion that was made in September last year. And so we'll be reporting back to council towards mid next year with this information, seeking council direction. Now that is the last slide for with regard to their action plan. There's also a council, a paper is on the agenda for a council meeting next week, providing an update across the notice of motion, which will also talk to some of this work. But I'm happy to take any questions.
Ian?
Yeah, thank you, Jan. Cam, what concerns me about what you've identified is, well, let me go back. Respectable physicians and people who understand the health risk of nitrates reckon there's a far more chance of causing human health problems from the anxiety around nitrates than nitrates themselves. And we heard from John this morning basically saying something similar. So my concern is if we go out and we without the right precautions, flag a whole lot of issues about private water wells and nitrates without the necessary information so that people understand the genuine risk, not the hyper risk, which the nitrate emergency instilled in people. We might cause more health problems than actually the nitrates will ever do. And so I just want to make sure there are safeguards in place that whatever messaging comes out, it's very clear what the responsible people are saying about the health risks of nitrates, not the irresponsible stuff, not the Greenpeace bullshit, all that crap.
Yes, thank you, through you, Chair, and that's a really important point. And so we're certainly kind of drawing on advice that the Water Services Authority of New Zealand, because they are putting advice around this as well, and guidance material together. We're drawing on the Medical Officer of Health, but that's certainly a risk, making sure that we've got good information out there, and pulling on those other key groups, in particular, some of those authorities from a health perspective.
Kia ora, Cam, thanks for that. And this is presentation 2 of, I think, of 4, and I think in the ones future next year we'll be covering some of the health issues, Ian, that you've just raised. So that'll be part of some of our presentations moving forward. Any other questions? I think we had Megan, kia ora, and Sarah.
Kia ora. So thank you for outlining what the plan is. When it comes to the data collection part, you've said to look at the domestic supplies around Canterbury, and I wanted to know if any thought has been given into looking at community facilities or marae, which are more, to me, that if there is a risk, there's more risk where people are going to be congregating and often at use. And if I just think about where I'm from, our marae is fundamentally considered an educational marae where we have loads and loads of school children there all day, every day. And so to me, if there is a risk, it's more heightened in those community facilities and areas that are more at use. Has there been thinking put around that?
Yes, absolutely. And we've, so basically we're going to get some GIS products and we'll overlay the marae GIS map with those 2 bits of information I talked to. So we've talked about that explicitly.
I think what I'm suggesting perhaps is where there's a higher risk that might require faster action. So prioritisation of those types of areas might be more important, is my suggestion. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Claire.
I guess my question's sort of related to Megan's, and it's around the the numbers game in a way. I guess I'm just thinking about a marae that hosts education things are probably over 25. They might be caught by another agency anyway. But from our staff, well, I hope you are, and you might not be able to answer it yet, but just thinking about your option 3 around facilitating treatment options and what they may be. I mean, from a public health perspective, we all know that E. coli is probably the number one public health perspective here as far as drinking water goes. And then that becomes, how does that fit in with this motion that we've got on the table and the work that you're to do? Because I think it would be quite concerning, and I guess I pick up on Ian's point, is concerning around if we finish up by focusing people so much on this that we actually miss the more acute and serious issues. So, sorry.
We'll get there. Through you, Chair, and thank you. Just a couple of things on that. One is that you'll notice that this is referred to as a drinking water action plan rather than a nitrate action plan, and that is deliberate. And it's for exactly the reason that you said. And then just something else that Cam said earlier on, which is that fundamentally, if you are taking water anywhere in Canterbury, it should have some form of treatment. And the treatment options that are available that happen to take out nitrate are extremely effective for taking out E. coli as well and other pathogens that could be transferred. So.
Kia ora, Sarah.
Thanks. Thank you, Chair. Yes, I agree with Claire on that point. That's E. coli is number one. With the wells, how secure they are, a lot depends on the depth of the well and whether they're from an unconfined or confined aquifer. Can we get some information on I know there's a lot of wells, but maybe some broad depths of wells in Canterbury, just to get an idea of the degree of exposure. But also, I'm looking at depths of wells that maybe a factory could use, that maybe be better as drinking water rather than for factory use or something like that, so that we look at the use of our drinking water and how we best use it, how we best plumb it in Canterbury. It's sort of like trying to make the most of what we have that's secure as far as E. coli, into the future. Anyway, just a broad idea. Thinking on my feet here.
Just in answer to the first part of what you were saying, it's the wells of Canterbury are at all sorts of depths, and to give you a map showing depths would not be a helpful thing to do. What I would say is that if you look on the Environment Canterbury data website and you look for a well search, if you're interested in a particular well, you can see how deep it is and how far it is down to groundwater as well. So that kind of information is around if you're interested in particularly. Across the Canterbury Plains, I'll just be slightly careful in saying this. Essentially, there are no confined aquifers apart from when you get down to the real coastal areas like under Christchurch. Sorry. So that across the main part of the Canterbury Plains, it is all an unconfined aquifer. So, and the depths where water is taken from is really dependent on where you can get the water from, but one of the difficulties here is that the traditional drinking water well for a farm building is into shallow groundwater, because that's the cheapest option when they were done, and it is the shallow groundwater that is more likely to be contaminated from any contaminant, and again, not just nitrate. But so that's where the risk lies.
It's important to understand that for any commercial use or food supply use, we have to test our bores, and so every dairy farm has to test their bores every year to get a consent for household supply for a new build or a new house. You actually have to test your bore and meet the water quality standards set by the district council. For commercial use, for factories and things, the water has to be tested as part of their quality assurance program. So there's no issue with people not knowing what the quality of their water is.
Sorry, it wasn't that what I was getting at. It's really making the most out of our purest water and making sure it's not being used for industrial use that's not requiring fresh water. So it was just a sort of looking after our highest quality water.
Remember, we just took this part of Cam's quarter was about the drinking water action plan. So, Genevieve.
In September, when the motion was passed, information, I think, Fiona, you might have circulated it to all of us, which identifies the depth of the well as a 2024 trend. I know we're not at 2025. So I can, with your permission, I can recirculate, and it shows the depth of the wells and the issues with the MAV levels. So I'll do that, if that's all right. Hasn't changed, no doubt. It's just a survey, annual survey. Yeah, it was based on it might have been the Selwyn study. Got it. It's a thread, so I'll send it round.
Oh yeah, I mean it was on those past presentation, I think. Yeah, you got that, Fiona? Yep, couple it. Tim, all right.
I was just seeking clarification there. That what I understand what your question is now, Genevieve. Sorry, apologies, I didn't quite understand. What was supplied last year was the depth of the wells that were done in the Selwyn study. So it's not across all of Canterbury; it's in the Selwyn study, as I understand.
So it was just this September, and it was asked because we'd just had a talk, and Councillor Southworth asked for detail because it was old data that was provided, and she asked for an update for the 2024, and this is what that entails, and it talks about from Waitaki right through to Selwyn. Is that okay? So I mean, do I send it? Where do I send it? It did go to all councillors as a response. So
look, absolutely fine to circulate. I'm just not quite sure what it is, but that's fine. I don't need to know. So. Oh, I know what you mean. Yes, I do. So it's an average. Yep, I understand. Yep. No, that's fine. Yep.
I mean, it's already been given out, so no problem there, Genevieve. Yep. Nick?
When's a good time to come back to what I was talking about earlier and close it off?
Oh, probably at the end. Yep. Hey, Cam, just on this one, how's land use brought into this?
As in land use surrounding those private wells. So we're not looking into that as part of this, as part of this drinking water. Well, as part of these bits of work that we've got underway. This is just looking around at kind of at-home treatment, essentially. However, just noting that we've got the planning framework, we've also got kind of compliance efforts and engagement efforts, and you will see a quarterly update on the compliance status in those drinking water protection zones, which is where the large part of our focus is from a drinking water perspective.
Thanks, Cam, for that. I think we're moving on. So we're halfway through. So just a quick 3-minute break, stand up stretch, because we're going to do another 1 hour and 15 sitting here in our chairs before we hand over to the Councillor Scott is going to talk about how great. Over to you, Doctor.
Kia ora, and thank you. And look, I just want to give a proper introduction to Professor Richard McDowell, who's sitting here on my right. Rich, many of you will know Rich. He was the chief scientist at the Our Land and Water National Science Challenge. He's a professor at Lincoln University, and he is also works, I keep on wanting to say ag research, at the New Zealand Institute of Bioeconomy Science. Have I got that right?
That'll do.
The new PRO that has been formed. So Rich is here, and he's going to talk through some of the work, particularly that's been done around the Central Plains. But before we do that, we just wanted to cover off, and this is a continuation of, where we've talked a bit about what nitrate is and what we can do about it, and some of the issues surrounding it. This is about where are the hotspots, where do we see it, how's it changed with time, and then in particular we want to look at lags, and I won't explain that now. I'll talk a little bit about lags as we go on, and that's when Rich starts coming in with some of the work that he's done recently. So I'm going to hand straight on to Fiona too.
Kia ora koutou. Look, I'm going to move through this part of the briefing relatively quickly so we've got time for the exciting lags discussion, and then for Rich to share more about his good work, which helps us to understand whether we can actually detect improvements in groundwater quality. So the map shown here gives us an indication of the hotspots. This is from a risk map that our science team prepared. And I won't go into much detail on it now, other than to say there's a fairly clear colour coding there, indicating areas of high, moderate and low risk. You see that the high risk areas are typically lower down on the plains, down gradient of more intensive land use. Now, Tim mentioned earlier that we are going to be bringing back some updated risk maps next year. So this is the snapshot of now, and we're working to provide a more nuanced version that we'll bring to you in the new year. So to understand a little bit more about where we're at now, it's quite helpful to look into the past. And I'm going to share with you some data from a paper that was published last year by two of our science group members, Philippa Aitchison-Earle and Melanie Knottenbelt. Now, what they did was compile a huge amount of data that they were able to access via paper archives. And those data are very helpful for us to have some greater insights over a longer time frame into historical groundwater quality. So we'll rattle through the decades shortly. Just hold fire for a second, Tim. But I just want to give you a little bit of background before we go full steam ahead. So it is important to note that the data that we're showing here were compiled from historical sampling records that were prepared by a range of different organisations. those organisations took these samples for different purposes. They included things like research projects by government agencies and catchment boards, as well as water quality sampling by health boards to understand drinking water quality. So, as you'll see shortly when we go through these decades, in some decades there were many more sampling locations considered than in others. And the coloured dots that you see on these maps show the maximum nitrate nitrogen concentration. So that means what you're seeing is the highest concentration in any well that was measured throughout that decade. It may have been that that individual dot represents the only sample taken from that specific location during that particular decade, or it could have been that that particular well was sampled multiple times, in which case the highest concentration is what is shown here. All right, let's go. So we're dialing back to the 1940s, and I just want to point out, as you're probably all familiar with already, that the maximum acceptable value of nitrate nitrogen in drinking water is 11.3 milligrams per litre. So you'll see on each of these slides the percentage of the sampling sites that were above that MAV concentration. The other piece of information that you're going to see on each of the slides is that top number there that talks about a concentration of nitrate nitrogen of 1.65 milligrams per litre. Where that number comes from is essentially what's considered a baseline condition for oxygenated groundwater. And that's really, it's considered as being a reference condition representing the nitrate nitrogen concentration that we would expect in minimally impacted groundwater. Rich was one of the authors on that paper, so if you've got questions on that, you can talk to him later. So in the 1940s, you can see that there were some samples taken, mostly clustered around Christchurch, and as well as a few additional samples down in South Canterbury, south of the Hurunui, where people were probably looking at water quality for drinking water supplies. At that time, there were a couple of wells in Timaru that had higher nitrate concentrations in multiple samples, and those high concentrations were also seen in samples from the same sites in later decades. On the right-hand side of the screen there, in the 1950s, you can see that there were more sites sampled, slightly greater spread of sites throughout the region, and very, very few sites were above that maximum acceptable value. So if you've got a snapshot memory, you'll see that in the 1960s there were fewer samples taken than there were in the 1950s. So perhaps there may have been a bigger study in the 50s that wasn't repeated in the 60s, or perhaps there may have been additional samples taken for public water supplies that we haven't actually been able to find the records for. Again, most sites were very much below the MAV, and 85% were below that baseline reference condition. On the right-hand side of the screen, you see data for the 1970s. And that decade saw major groundwater investigations conducted by a range of organisations. Those investigations, as you can see, did show some areas of elevated nitrate concentration. And once those data were available, that prompted private well owners to request water quality tests. Hence the relatively large number of samples that were actually taken during that decade. That decade too was renowned for having a succession of very wet winters between 1973 and 1979. So if you remember back to last week's briefing where we talked about the solubility of nitrate in water, some of those high concentrations likely represent a flush of nitrate into groundwater following those wet winter events.
Can I just ask another question? You'll forgive me. So
up until 1990, when we started to come into existence and those things, were they county councils that did that sampling, or was it the health board, or was it the district council? Who was it that actually did the sampling?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. There were a range of organisations that did the sampling. So there were catchment boards, there were research studies, there were health boards. So a real mix of folks looking at water quality for their own different purposes. Yeah. So fast forward to the 1980s. And you'll see that in the 1980s there were, again, fewer samples taken that decade. But that decade was important because it did signal the start of a long-term groundwater quality monitoring program, which started in North Canterbury in 1986. On the right-hand side, into the 1990s, again, there's more samples taken in that decade, a greater distribution between the northern and southern parts of the whole region. And if you look at the numbers on the bottom of the slide there, again, a slightly higher proportion of sites just ticking up with concentrations greater than the maximum acceptable value. We then get into the 2000s, again, many more sites sampled, and we're starting to see your eye can be kind of drawn to those reddish coloured hotspots with the higher nitrate concentrations. But if you look really closely, there are quite a few orange coloured spots, which is around half the MAV, that kind of draw you in to perhaps making it look extra hot. If we look at the numbers at the bottom of the slide there, we're now up in the 2000s to 12% of sites sampled being above the MAV, and then into the 2010s ticking up into 14% of those sites being greater than the MAV. Now, go for it, Tim. What we can tell you about the wells that were sampled there, and particularly in relation to your question earlier, Sarah, that the data that are presented here in these decadal images, the well depth for them is weighted towards shallower wells, and it's not consistent through time. In any of those given decades that we've presented here, between 40 and 70% of the wells were less than 30 metres deep. So there are a huge number of samples, more than 4,200 samples in this historical data set. So a really, really rich package of information for us. And it does help paint a picture of how the spatial distribution of concentrations has changed a little bit and evolved over time. This study has not accounted for climate, rainfall, land use or anything like that. It's simply providing a representation of this fantastic historical data set. And what you've seen as we flick through the decades that, yes, there were land use impacts already evident in nitrate concentrations in some areas in the 1970s. In some of those cases, some of the same wells that were sampled in the 1970s that had those higher concentrations had lower concentrations when they were sampled in the 1980s. So that may suggest that perhaps those wet winters did have a role to play in concentrations in that decade. What you also have seen as we've moved through time is that there are an increasing number of wells with maximum nitrate concentrations above the MAV. And I'll pass back to Tim now, who is going to tell you about lags.
Just before we go on to the lags, Sarah, have you got a question just about the maps?
Sorry to ask this question. Is there any chance we could have the last 5 years mapped?
Our science group does an annual groundwater survey, so we can share the information that that's provided on an annual basis there. This is quite a sort of a different study rather than going 5 years at a time, but Tim's got some data that are coming up that show 5-year trends in nitrate concentration. So hold that thought and we'll see whether we might address part of it here.
Kapai through you, Tim.
Got it. So I want to move on to talk a little bit about lags and lag times, which is a really big issue, and it's important that you have an understanding of what we're talking about and why we're talking about it. And I just want to highlight a report that's on our website. It's there, came out in 2023, and it's looking at nitrate lags, which is to do with the length of time that it takes nitrate-laden water to get through into groundwater and to a particular well at a place. That's what it's a lag time that we're talking about. But so there's the summary of information about nitrate lag times in Canterbury, and I'm going to come back to that report in a minute. But just to give you an understanding, if you think about the diagram on the left up here, is the timer that you can see on your right is just referring to the fact that every step of the way it takes time for these things to happen, and time in this case is measured in years, not in seconds or minutes, or by and large. But the time to change a farm system, if we're talking about instigating change, is not immediate. It takes to move. Whether it be a cropping farm being moved into dairy farming, or a cropping farm changing its practices, that does not happen overnight. That takes several years often before that. So there's a lag time in terms of the time taken to make that change. There's this issue of nitrogen to nitrate that we talked about in the nitrogen cycle, and I won't go into that in any great detail now, but particularly the time taken to filter down through the soil. So we talked about good management practice being trying to keep that nitrogen in the soil, but it does move down, and it takes time for that to move down. And of course, that depends a lot on the depth of the soil, things like organic matter content. All of these things influence the amount of time that takes. Then once you reach the bottom of the soil, you get into the unsaturated zone, or sometimes referred to as the vadose zone, which is this area between the soil and the groundwater. So this is an area that it's not fully wet, but water moves down through it. So it's an unsaturated state. And that can take quite a long time, because in some places, like at the top of the Canterbury Plains where we stood at the Rakaia Gorge, that vadose zone can be a kilometre deep, certainly hundreds of metres deep for it to move down, and it takes a long time. But it will vary in how quickly it moves through, depending on the structure of the stones and things like that. So it's not something that's uniform, but it takes time. And then there's the time taken to travel in groundwater. So once it's in the groundwater, actually moving towards a stream. And perhaps I should have said right at the start of this that this presentation is the same as last week's, and there's a lot of information in here. We're not talking to all of it. It's really meant as kind of reference for you, and you can look up other stuff on it as well. So, but if we're talking about lag times, this is just giving an idea. So if we just concentrate first of all on the diagram, you can see I talked about the time taken, and the time taken for shallow groundwater might be a matter of months before it reaches a stream, if it's nearby to a stream. But it could be decades for it to get through the deep groundwater, and it could be centuries for it to get right across the Canterbury Plains. So, these things vary, and again, they vary in space as well, because the layers are not the same. And, we could see that when we were looking at the Canterbury, those cliffs up at the Rakaia Gorge. But I was going to say we talk about nitrate lags having two. It's actually I talk about lags having two types of lag. That's a regulatory lag and a biophysical lag. So the biophysical is mostly what I've talked about so far, which is to do with how long it takes for it to get through. And again, it's not uniform. It's not uniform across the plains, and of course the plains have varied land use across them. The regulatory lag, what I refer to when I'm talking about that is that, for example, the Selwyn Waihora plan came in 2015, But some of the rules that were in there were saying that dairy farms had to have a 30% reduction beyond good management practice by, and John will tell me the year and I just can't remember it, 2030. So it takes, now that doesn't mean everybody waits till 2030 to do it. In fact, we know that a lot have done it before, but it's a staggered thing, and so there's a regulatory lag. And yes, we've set some rules, but it takes a while for them to come into force. And then we've got a diversity of land use across the Canterbury Plains, and I'll just put this up to show you some of this diversity. The purple in this case is arable or cropping farming, and the sort of olivey green is intensive grass production, which a fair amount of which is dairy farming, not all of it. But this is just giving you an idea that it's diverse out there. It's not just diverse under the Canterbury Plains, it's diverse on top as well. And there are different rules for the different types of farming. So dairy farming, 30% in the Selwyn-Waihora area. Other types of farming have different reductions. So that when I talk about this regulatory lag, it's also things that are different around the place. It's not everything coming in a uniform. It's not that suddenly in 2015 there has been this sudden reduction. It takes time, and it takes time for farm systems to adjust. So that's what I'm referring to when I talk about a regulatory lag. And then there's the biophysical lag, which is to do with how long it takes for nitrate-laden groundwater.
I'll just make a point on the 2030. We had to have the rules in place by 2022 with the expectation of outcomes by 2030. So we weren't waiting till 2030. 2022 was the complete application of the rules, but the expectation you were on the pathway to the outcome by 2030.
So I've got a question, Tim, because I was dealing with the Vardas zone in about early 2012 when I was trying to establish the pathway for nitrates from a conversion I was looking at doing actually into the river, and the science didn't exist. And so are we any further forward in terms of understanding what a regulatory, what the lag time would be for different areas across Canterbury? You're talking about different depths. And the understanding of that, because it goes to consenting and it goes to risk, doesn't
it? Hold that thought, because that's what Rich is going to be talking on some of these things. So, yeah, hold that thought.
Kapai, you've heard, hold those thoughts. We've got to get through this presentation. Write them down.
Okay. So, the lag report, I call it the lag report, this report here about nitrate lag times, one of the conclusions from it is that based on the knowledge that we have of groundwater age distribution, and it is really important to remember it is an age distribution, as in when we take a sample of groundwater, it's not that it is all one age. It is a distribution, and you'll find that some of it, most of it is younger or older, but it will have come from different places, and it's a distribution. But based on our knowledge of age distribution, and also, and this is what a large part of this report is looking at, how quickly did we see degradation after substantial land use change? So it's looking at it the other way around rather than the improvement side. And it suggests that we should see improvements in some shallow groundwater within 5 years. And this really backs up some other work that Rich has done around lag times across New Zealand and what we would expect to see. So that's saying that we should see improvements in some shallow groundwater within 5 years, but change will take longer in other places. So the question then becomes, well, 5 years, we're in 2025, are we seeing changes? So let me take you on a story. The first thing is, here we have 10-year trends in the groundwater report the map was shown from before, and the drinking water report that comes out annually looks at 10-year trends. And there's a really good reason why we use 10-year trends, because if you go shorter than 10 years, there's climatic variation. And Fiona talked about in the 1970s, there were these really wet years and you get flushes of nitrate-laden water getting into the groundwater, and you can see higher. And so when you're talking about trends, if you do it over too short a period, it can be influenced by the climate. So we've tended to use 10-year trends. That's great. But actually, we want to know more than that, because we want to know, I just said that the lag report was suggesting we should see changes within 5 years. So can we look at shorter than 10 years? But when we look at the 10-year trends, you can see from here that, let me just explain one little thing when you do trend analysis. So trend analysis is a statistical test, and in it you come up with things like these categories of very likely increasing. So that means getting worse, increasing concentration, worse water quality. So very likely increasing. Likely increasing means it probably is increasing, but there's a bit more scatter in the data. And then there's, you really can't tell, it's all over the place. And then there's likely decreasing, likely getting better, and very likely. So it's all to do with how much scatter there is. It's statistical testing that can be done. And these are the categories that we use. And when I say we, these are used across New Zealand. It's a standardised way of looking at trend analysis. Now, when you look at these data and the 10-year trends, then what we're seeing is that over 50%, or it's around 50%, are likely increasing or very likely increasing, as in getting worse. So it's not a good story by any stretch of the imagination. So bearing that in mind and thinking, well, what evidence do we have of change? So, we know that things are changing. And here are just a few things that are pulled together. But the graph that you can see there is the nitrogen losses that are coming through the regional dairy summary from Overseer. Now, Overseer is a fantastic data resource because they collect so much information on farms, particularly dairy farms, but not just dairy farms, across Canterbury. And when you look at this, you go, well, okay, from 2014 to 2023, there's about a 40% reduction in the nitrogen loss that's being recorded through Overseer. That's big. That's a big reduction. So again, if this is real, then can we see this in our data? Equally, Central Plains Water Limited have got about a 29% reduction over their command area. It's not all dairy farming, so that it varies where you are. And then we know that in the Land and Water Plan there were substantial reductions required. And they vary across the region, as Lisa was saying. So this is all saying, in terms of the inputs, there are substantial changes. Can we see it in the data? So when we start exploring the data, so going back a step and saying the lag report says we should be able to see it. All of the input data says that the change is happening. Can we see it? Well, here's a couple of wells that are up near Fairley. You can see Fairley is, say Fairly well down. And the Lake Opuha is in the middle. It's that sort of black area that you can see there. And here are two wells, both in areas where there is quite a lot of dairy farming. And you can see the colours that are shown. So that's with time, is across the x-axis here. And then the colours are just referring to red is above the drinking water standard. Orange is sort of in the middle, and then green is below, and I just can't remember what the figure is, 6, I think, or something like that. Half MAV, that's right, sorry, it's half MAV. Now, the point about these is that here are two wells where we are seeing quite a substantial reduction in the nitrate concentrations. And these are areas where The changes that have happened on farm are to do with good management practice being implemented. It's not an area where the sub-regional plan, that there have been a few more things coming lately, but at the time of the change in about 2015, that's all to do with the regional plan and good management practice. So we are seeing an improvement in the water quality. So this backs up what the LAG report's saying, that we should be able to see some changes. They're still quite high though. You know, those are still quite high concentrations. So, but we are seeing a change, which is encouraging. So then what other evidence do we have? Well, this is a piece of work that was done by Lincoln Agritech, looking at wells in the Central Plains Water Command area. So that's part of the Selwyn Waihora area or water zone where the Central Plains water irrigation area is. And this is looking at 5-year trends versus 10-year trends. So the orange data, have we got that? Hang on, I've got to get it right. No, sorry, they're both 5-year trends, aren't they? Sorry. They're 5-year trends. Blue is from 2016 to 2020. Sorry, I've got a drink here. I'm still getting over my cough from last week. Blue is 2016 to 2020, and the orange is the more recent data. And again, what that's showing is that you've got a lot more wells that are improving. They're decreasing concentration in this area. So these 5-year trends would say, maybe we are seeing something. But you've got to bear in mind this thing about, well, maybe that's a climate influence. Maybe it's climate that's driven that. Hold that thought. Then we thought, okay, well, that's interesting, the Lincoln Agritech data. Let's have a look at our wells across all of Canterbury. And this is slightly different because this is looking at 10-year trends versus 5-year trends. So this is all across Canterbury. It's not just in the Central Plains area. It's all of our wells. And what it's showing us is that when we look at the 5-year data, again, we're seeing more improvements, or probably less getting worse, might be the other way of putting it, than we are in the 10-year data, trend data. So again, it's pointing to maybe we are starting to see some of the improvements. So I said, and I'm going to hand on to Rich and from here on, except just to say that I said that climate is a factor here. So the question is, can we eliminate climate as something when we're looking at our data? And can we have a really good idea of what the actions are on farm? And this is where I'm going to hand on to Rich to talk about the work that he's been leading on this issue.
Kia ora, peeps. Thanks, Tim. So you're going to get a little snippet of a wider piece of work and a piece of evidence that I gave the Minister and MFE around the efficacy or not of freshwater farm plans improving water quality. Right at the end of it was a case study that focused on Central Plains water for a number of reasons. The chief amongst those was that they had an abundance of data in a good format that I could use. And I happened to know them, so I could sweet talk them into giving it to me. So Tim's quite right. So he's gone over lag times, but there's there's something sitting outside here. It's the influence of climate. And climate is an amplifier. Okay, so it can either pulse things through, nitrate through, or retain it if it's a dry year, for example. So you've got those two factors mixing with actions or good management practices, as you folk call them. Now, we want to be able to attribute water quality changes to improvements in actions, so you have to remove the influence of lag times and climate, just to leave those actions as the sole cause of change. part of that is climate, and I've given you a couple of rivers here. So the same thing happens in groundwaters as in rivers. It just happens to occur much quicker in rivers. It's less, in between. So you've got the Southern Oscillation Index there, and you've got a water quality trend on the right-hand side. The SOI, or Southern Oscillation Index, is just a dipole between two parts of the Pacific Ocean, controls our weather in usually 7-year cycles. You get wet and dry years. Now, in the bottom, you'll see the Huranui. Wet years, more nitrate being pulsed through, higher concentrations, influences the trends. So it's very well in sync. A river in the North Island, though, you could argue it's either indeterminate or possibly inverse to that. So the important point is we know where climate influences not only rivers, but also likely influences climate as well now. So the Central Plains, I mentioned, it's got an abundance of data in a good format. That data consists not only of farm plans and the actions that were done within them, but also the quantity of reductions as a result of that, and who was doing what, where, and when. Admittedly, the scheme itself is developed in 3 stages, so there were some areas that were influenced by these plans earlier than others, but we know those too. They also, I don't know who this, maybe this was part of the consent, had to put in wells. So they've got 20 wells that they do regular sampling on. There are also ECAN wells in there. Now, the Central Plains wells happen to be a lot shallower, and hence the water is likely to be younger. In fact, I can tell you the water, on average, in those wells is only 4.5 years old, compared to 37.8 in the ECAN wells in the same command area. Okay, so you are likely to see the canary in the coal mine in those Central Plains wells before you will see them in the ECAN wells. Now, here's the issue. Tim has highlighted this, the influence of climate. And we know if you have a wet year, you'll get greater recharge, i.e. that is pulsing through of the water, surplus water, through into the aquifer, carries the nitrate with it. Dry year, inverse. Doesn't happen. Now, in a 10-year period, you might see that climate being buffered. Okay, so it has less of an effect. But as if you were to look at the first 5 years and the second 5 years, you'll get a completely different picture. Depending on your proclivity for oh, woe is me, you might be saying the first 5 years, everything is going in a hell in a handbasket. In the second 5 years, you might be going, oh, everything's improving. But what's true? Because there's the influence of climate in both of these factors, in both of these trends. Okay? But let's go back to what data we have. So, as part of their consent, those farm plans had an audit grade. Those audit grades related to a range of actions that were implemented. And as part of those audits, of course, they ticked off whether or not they were doing them or not. Those practices themselves related to a quantity or a load of nitrogen that was being reduced. They had to, on average, aim for around that 30%. They appear to have done that. Also, as part of this, they did overseer runs as well. Okay, so they have quantitative information on the implementation or the effect of those actions as they were implemented. Now, you could argue that, okay, if an auditor comes in and they happen to tick the box on that particular day, yes, you've got actions that are occurring, maybe the day after they're not, or maybe the day before they're not. But, we're going to take that on faith that, yes, those actions are being implemented, and hence the implementation lag is short. We can discount that. What we're left with, therefore, is a quantity of nitrogen being reduced from a property, which you can add up across a number of properties. And so this is the technique that I'm going to run you through, hopefully a little bit slowly. On the top left there, you will see the farm level reductions associated with the implementation of those actions, varying from almost zero, yes, to quite a bit. Now, importantly, what I've overlaid there is a little dot and what I call a wedge of cheese, or a capture zone. That capture zone relates to the source area, the contributing area through to that well. Now, that wedge will vary according to the flow lines and where the aquifer goes, but we know the quantity of reduction in terms of nitrogen associated with that wedge. What you see in those dots in the other plot is the receiving well. Okay, so if you were looking at that, you would go, okay, well, it's just increasing and there's no real change there. But we know that these actions were implemented around the 2017-18 year. And if you're still a skeptic, you'd be looking at that and saying, okay, well, it's increasing after that. But then it reaches a period just after 2021 where it's actually decreasing. So the question here is that real? So we've got to take away climate. We've got to take away the lag time to say, is the effect of the actions implemented in 2017-18 period having the effect there? So here's a very simple expression of a lag time. We know what those leaching numbers from overseer were, and that's what those blue lines are. You can see they increase and then they decrease. Very simply, the peak in leaching occurs around 3 years before the peak being observed in the well. That's your lag time. That's your biophysical lag time. You can also reinforce that with tritium data. It's an isotope. I won't go into the technique, but it said that the average age of the water in that well happened to be 2.8. So there's 2 lines of evidence there which says that the lag time is around 2.5 to 3.5 years old. Okay, so we know what the lag time is. We now look at the climate. On the top there, you've got the recharge, okay? So that's the expression of surplus water after precipitation that's now flowing through into the aquifer. And you can see the bars go up and down. In and around 2017-18, though, there was a larger amount of recharge, which means it pulsed that nitrate through. So you have to adjust those concentrations, and that's what that red line is now. So it's now increasing, okay? So we've adjusted what's being lost for the climate. We also know what the lag time is, so we can adjust that and mirror it in the groundwater itself. And so that's what those red X's are. So it's shifted across 3 years, okay? And now it's reasonably well aligned with what you observed, the black dots, okay? So you've removed the influence of lag time. You've removed the influence of climate. And so you conclude that these decreases in the last few years are real, and that decrease is attributable to actions that were taken in 2017-18. Of course, you know, there's confidence intervals around that. So you can say with a greater or lesser degree of certainty about that, depending on the well. But importantly, we've now done that for all the wells that were under the command of Central Plains, okay? So these are the times when we would likely see the improvements coming through. The particular well that I showed you was near Hororata, so it's one of those ones in the 2025 tranche, okay? You will see some of them that obviously respond quite quickly. I've given you, obviously, the good news. There are others that won't respond very quickly. Now, there are reasons for that. Some could be that they are actually influenced by the 2 major rivers. Okay, so they're very well buffered by those, and so there's not a great deal of variation. Others may be that the variability in the data is so high that you can't see very good trends. You could improve that by greater sampling density in those areas, and there is some improvements that could be made there. But what this tells you is effectively it's a hotspot of times for when you are likely to see the actions starting to improve. As I say, there are 20 other wells that E can hold. They are older and hence will likely be less responsive to this technique, but there is opportunity to do that as well. These conclusions are actually for MFE, but I think, I think that I would take home from this actually is I do this sort of work globally, and indeed I gave this presentation to the EU, and an Irish contingent are actually going to implement this next year across the Republic, across 5,000 wells. They'll be looking at this sort of technique. But what the advantage that we have here, and especially in Canterbury, is a long record of farm planning and a long and comprehensive set of data, which enables this technique and probably this work to be done across the entire region, if not the country. And to my knowledge, this is probably one of the only places where that has that data. So I don't know if there was any sort of foresight, but I thought I'd just add that in. It's it's actually quite encouraging from a science point of view, and also from an attribution point of view. I guess on the flip side of that, it will change as we get more information about not only the lag times, but how they're distributed across both the region and the country. And also, we've got to recognise that both intensity and also new actions may come along line, but we can probably account for those now. So I just thought I'd just leave it there and answer any questions.
I'll just quickly finish on. Just overall, just finish the, which is really just to sort of sum up what we've been talking about, the drinking water action plan that Cam was talking to, the nitrate in groundwater with time that Fiona talked about, the nitrate lags, the biophysical and the regulatory lag, means that it does take time to see the impacts. And then fundamentally what the data that Rich has produced is something that, when we look at some of our data, we are seeing improvements. And then what Rich has been able to do is pull that out and say, well, okay, that's in some cases, that's not linked to climate, it's not linked. We're taking out the lag time, and therefore that we are seeing some improvements as a result of actions. So,
Kia ora, Rich, thanks for that. I think we've got a few questions here. I'll start with Peter, then we have Ashley, and then Jen.
Thank you for observing my question. Rich, my question is pretty simple, really, in terms of this, because we started talking about the Vardas zone and those sorts of things. So, is there an opportunity for denitrification, or are they pure numbers that are moving through? So if it's a 6.8 here, it ends up being a 6.8 after 3 years. So does that follow?
Yeah, so you'll have zones of denitrification and obviously zones where you don't have that occurring. That's not going to influence your lag time though. Okay, so
there could be a problem.
Absolutely, yeah. If you hit a zone of denitrification or anoxia, you will have a step change, okay? A step change reduction in the quantity of nitrogen going through.
Kia ora, Ashley.
Okay, I've got two. The first one was an observation that Central Plains water study by Lincoln Agritech, where I used to work. I actually talked to Helen about that just before I left and was going to do a story, but I resigned instead. From memory, we were talking about it, and she said that it seemed very likely in the first 5 years there was a period of heavy rainfall that followed a period of low rainfall. So probably in those first 5 years, there was nitrates being flushed through that had accumulated over several years. Can you confirm that?
Yes, that's likely. Yep. So hence the recharge.
So I just sort of thought I'd add what the conversation I'd had about that. My other question goes back further in the presentation when we were talking about the lag time, and the time to shallow groundwater is in months to 1 to maybe 3 years. And I think Fiona, you said something like about 40% of private wells are less than 30 metres. Is that...
I'll just clarify that before you get to the rest of the question. So the decadal information that was presented about the historical sampling information coupled with the monitoring information we had from the 1980s onwards, between 40 to 70% of the wells that were shown in those plots of any decade were less than 30 metres deep. It's not a generic application to the depth of private drinking water supplies.
Right, thanks for clarifying that. But I guess my point is that in those shallow groundwater wells, if they're still being used, we should be able to see a change in nitrate concentrations in 2-3 years, rather than thinking about 10 years or 15 years or 20 years. I'm talking here only about shallow groundwater wells, not ones down to 200 metres or whatever.
I'll have a go, and Rich, you come in on it as well. That look, in theory, you're absolutely right, but there are a few other complicating factors, of which the shallow groundwater that we're talking about is actually the depth that it is taken from the groundwater. It can still be a long way from the surface to that groundwater. So when we say shallow groundwater, we're talking about water that is taken in the top 30 to 40 metres of the groundwater column, but it can still be a long way for it to come down. So that's a kind of a complicating factor on it. And then, of course, there's the whole thing about, well, what's actually happened in the surrounding area. So that's but I mean, in simple terms, that you're absolutely right.
So my point is basically what's happening in surrounding areas. Well, you will be able to, if there's a change in what's happening in surrounding areas, a significant change, you will be able to see that relatively quickly in the shallow groundwater. And by relatively quickly, I mean 2 to 3 years rather than 15 to 20 years.
Yes, but there will be times when you don't. But I mean, I would also say that, of course, that's one of the reasons why shallow groundwater is a problem for things like E. coli, because it moves quickly, and therefore viruses and things that could be associated with E. coli could be with it as well. So.
There's only one caveat to this. I absolutely agree that shallower it is, the younger it is, the more responsive it will be. What tends to happen with private wells is they only get sampled very infrequently, though. So if, for example, you were to sample on the 2016 here, and as is common once a year in 2018, you'd be saying, oh, it's going down. So there's expectation management here as well. The data that we have for Central Plains, for example, is done monthly, so you get a richer pattern as opposed to two ends that look like this, like that.
Kia ora, Jen.
Thank you for your discussion today, and particularly about the Central Plains water information and the wells that you can have within that scheme. It's good to see an example, but I'm wondering what other opportunities we have in relation to obtaining similar data from other schemes that could provide so much of the overall picture. Because this might be a good example. I'm not saying everything, I don't want to paint everything with a similar brush. I don't know, but we should know. And so that would be a really cool opportunity. And so is there anything further in your research that could look at other models and schemes?
Yes. So the technique is amenable to doing this across all the irrigation schemes, and it would make sense because they hold data. The only caveat to that, though, is that the data is in various states or various quality. Quality associated with how it's housed and also how it was collected. So the likelihood of, for example, generating that map on the top left, I can't say until I get access to all of it, but the intent is definitely to start undertaking that funding permitting.
Perhaps I can just add a little bit to what Richard said, because he's being very careful and what he's saying quite rightly, that we are exploring possibilities around funding at the moment. So,
I can understand why you're being cautious, fair enough. But I think it should be a provision, actually, of holding such a consent, that they provide information that we can use like that. And having, I mean, I don't mean it in a political sense or anything like that. I just mean we need the data to fill in the gaps, or else we really can't have an overall state of the environment reporting. So, there must be a means of doing something at this level, surely.
Andrea, same point.
Just for a long-term plan, do we need to put a figure in there for this kind of work? And if so, are we talking millions? I mean, I'm just because if we need to do it, we got to do it soon, right?
the reason I'm being slightly careful is because I'm very mindful of ratepayer money, and we're exploring many opportunities for funding, of which Environment Canterbury would be part of it, and we're hoping that we can get other funding as well. So we're pretty hopeful we can get funding. So if it was all to fall on us, then it probably is a long-term plan conversation. But if we're able to leverage off others, then I think it's something that we can move forward pretty quickly.
So. Kia ora, same point, Ian, and then John F.
Yeah, just be aware that MHV and Ashburton Lyndhurst are both collecting a lot of data. I mean, I think MHV area, which is the Ashburton to the Rangitata, there's 180 wells being sampled. It was on a weekly basis. I think it's down to a monthly basis. And Ashburton Lyndhurst has got something similar now. Whether it's whether the data is in a format that you can use or not, Richie, I don't know. I don't understand that because I don't know what your requirements are. But while I've got the microphone, I might just ask the other question I was going to ask, which is the MHV data that I've been privy to quite a lot of. They've broken it out into, because wet years don't come in 5-year lumps, which is sort of what some people were trying to assume. You get wet years and dry years and wet years and dry years. And what they've done is they've looked at they've taken out the wet years and put them in one data set and the dry years in another data set. And it tends to be showing the same trends that you're showing for Central Plains area, which is certainly a plateauing and potentially a decrease in nitrates being recorded. As a methodology, does that tick the boxes for you, Richie?
I'll tackle three things. First of all is the amount of money it takes to do this sort of work. Just to give you a ballpark in the first instance, one sampling to get an age dating is $1,000. Okay, so it's quite a level of investment required that's beyond the council, but it's an important conversation to have as part of the mix. The irrigation schemes is another element of this, and I'm talking to them next Friday. The technique that you're talking about there, Ian, I think would be okay if all the wells were at the same depth and all of the same age. And that's the problem, you see, because you'll have a mix of ages and depths. So a wet year could be quite responsive in a shallow well, but it might take a lot longer in a deeper well. So, depending on both the age and the depth of those wells, that might work. Hence why you have to go down this route. Does that make sense?
Kia ora, thanks for that, Rich. John F.
Thanks for that. Two questions, and they're sort of co-joined. The good management practice is a key driver of making improvements. And you mentioned the organic matter in the soil. And with there's relatively new movement to bale grazing. has there been any studies completed on the effectiveness of bale grazing and slowing down that lag period of moving down through into the Vados area? And the other one was, given the influence of wet winters, will climate change eventually have an improvement on the pace of water quality?
I'll answer the first one. So bale grazing results in a concentration of stock around the bales. It is designed principally to remove those animals from what we will call a critical source area. So has a modest effect in that respect. I wouldn't necessarily say it has a huge amount of effect related to urine, though. Okay, so that's the first instance. Climate change, if we could predict that in the future, to the degree where you are able to know a wet versus dry year, then possibly. It's just too much of an unknown, I'm afraid, to influence this sort of work.
Supplementary. There was a funding for a chap up in Waiau that had $1.5 million for a potential nitrogen improvement, spreading it via a cow. Do you know much about that and whether that would alter?
You're getting the finger then, John, so that was probably your cautionary comment. Nick Moody and then Sarah.
Okay, thank you. So to return to what we were talking about after the first presentation, which I had to cut off in the interest of time, as governors, we always aim to be science-based, balanced, and solution-focused. I didn't get to the solution on that one. So to loop back, in sum, when we look at our catchments and the actions to address these matters across Canterbury, I talked about how collaborative environmental governance risks being less than democratic, less than fair, and less than good for the environment. And of course, we all want to be collaborative, and me too. You'll hear me talking strongly and regularly on the importance of pulling together and working together. I might send the paper around about that. I've taken that information from. And looking back over, say, back to 2010, we can see this playing out, as we've learned today, with the increased nitrates generally across our region under the Canterbury Water Management Strategy, a collaborative strategy. And that's why I keep pushing for a report reviewing about how it worked to inform us as we move forward and look to our new model, which has got a different name, but is a similar, from what I can understand, a collaborative and sort of zone or catchment-based model. And the positive, the solution-focused part of this is that this model can work when we've got a strong regulatory backstop. So when we know, okay, we've got a bottom line we're working to, there's a level of nitrate leaching that's acceptable to us, and it's in law and it's enforced. And then we can collaborate, to achieve that in our communities. And that's the best of both worlds. And having worked here, for 6 years as a compliance officer, it's my view that we've done a very poor job of that compliance, and that's part of what's got us in the problem we're in today. And so to have our collaboration, to have our business, to have our clean water, and to move forward together as a region, that's why you saw me talking in my priorities today, that compliance and upholding the rules we have is a key thing we can do, a lever we can pull to ensure we've got a clean environment, healthy environment, and great business. And we heard from Councillor Sunknall, thoughts that we might not have those powers, in the future. And so that's why I feel a sense of urgency to do everything we can now while we're here to lead in the space and achieve the best for our communities. So that was the balance part of it and the solution focus, which I didn't get to before. So I felt it's important to loop back to that. Thank you.
Kia ora, Nick. Thanks for that. Talking about compliance, big issue on some of these matters. Sarah.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just a question around, thank you very much too, the cool work that you're doing. Really interesting. Tim, got a question about overseer. How the Central Plains water, so if we have an increase in, addressing the urine patch for dairy cows. And then if we have an increase in herd numbers and also herd numbers, how... Sorry? No. So how would that affect your overseer graph, or would it affect the graph?
Yeah, I'll go back to it just so we know what we're looking at. This one here. So this is based on the data that overseer collect on, which includes herd numbers and all of the farm practices, and then modelled through to look at the N loss. I saw a figure the other day to do with when the peak number of cows in Canterbury, and was it 2014? I was going to say 15, but I knew it was in that time. So what we've seen since then is a pretty stable, slightly declining number in terms of, these are generalised across the whole of Canterbury. So is that answering your question? I'm not quite sure.
I've just been reading lately that we're having an increase in cow numbers in Canterbury and conversions from cropping, which is nitrate being spread across the paddock, to dairying, which obviously is all about the urine patch, which is a concentrated form of nitrate leaching into the soils. Thank you.
Okay, I understand what you're referring to, and I mean you're absolutely right in that a major issue in dairy farming is the urine patches and the concentration that goes with that, and it's a major source of nitrate leaching. The one thing I would say, just to be careful on, and there's nobody here from consenting who can talk to it in real detail, but I'll give you an overview. When there are the numbers given on the number of consented cows in Canterbury increasing, that is to do with the consents that are being given for essentially for spreading of dairy effluent, and there still has to be a total nitrogen load to allow those cows to actually be there. Then the conversion still has to, a conversion would have to be showing that it is not increasing nitrogen load. So I'm not saying those cows will never get here, but there is another step to go through before those cows would be allowed through with a farming land use consent. So that the consent that has been given so far allows a conversion, and it allows for the spreading of effluent from a certain number of cows, but it doesn't allow for a farming land use consent within a total nitrogen limit in the Canterbury, in Selwyn Waihora or wherever it might be. So that they are not fully consented is kind of what I'm trying to say. But I haven't. Lisa, are you able to explain it better than I can?
So Tim, maybe we can come back. We can back that in a later presentation if we need to, or a particular councillor, because I know it's some councillors got to leave for 3:30 GCP and other meetings. So Sarah, have you got a supplementary, and then we're over to Claire, and that'll be it.
Okay, just supplementary. We're on the most vulnerable soils, the lighter soils, the thinner soils. Will you be in the spatial planning? Maybe, if we, depending on what happens next week, be looking at maybe converting to herd farms so that we're not, that to reduce the nitrate loads into shallow aquifers.
That's exactly the sort of thing that a spatial plan could allow to, be considered in a spatial plan. Whether it is or not, that's for future work to work on. But that's exactly what a spatial plan, allows for that sort of thing. Sorry, Lisa, you're the.
It's a really good question, and it kind of connects to that risk-based compliance work that Jen was talking about yesterday. So it's something that sort of, as we sort of develop a new plan framework, we're going to be looking at how we can use sort of risk-based approaches to start sort of shaping, making sure that we've got the right kinds of activities in the right places. Assuming that's something that we're able to do under the new system. Who knows? Yeah.
Councillor Mackay, Claire Mackay.
Thank you. Just, Tim, when you just do check up, I think from the consents perspective, most of the farms have probably got a land use consent that they're tight that they've got to stay within. So they're probably already tied in there anyway, because otherwise I don't think they would get the dairy effluent consent as well. So, but if you can just, Elaine's shaking her head. No, I said yeah. Oh, no, yeah. So, but perhaps because it is something that people don't understand, it might be worth just getting that from the consent team. I think just if I can, I want to circle back to Genevieve's question, I think it was, around the information. There's a heck of a lot of information out there held by our irrigation collectives. And it would be nice to be able to access that, but I don't think that we as councillors sitting here should sit here and think that we're all going to get that for naught or nothing, because it's actually all been paid for pretty much by the shareholders of those respective companies, and the generosity has allowed Richard to go and do his work. And I think that our biggest fear is, and we've heard it quite frequently, and we hear it quite frequently, well, why would we listen to your information? It's been funded by you, or as in an industry body, or dairy industry, for example, that gets independent people to do science work, and then it gets weaponised. And so there will be some challenges in how we actually negotiate that, and hopefully we can access that information, because it's the sort of things that we don't want to duplicate. But please be aware that we don't want to see it weaponised.
Taff will have an answer.
Thank you. So just to give you a quick update on the conversations that we've been having with some of the irrigation schemes as part of the rural sector hui that we've been having. One of them is around sharing data, and that's also one of the streams within the Smart Enabling Regulator, is how can we use data that's already in existence? How can we make sure that we've got trusted platforms where we are sharing and not duplicating effort in that space as well? So coming out of that hui that we've been having with those CEs from the rural sector is also forming a science group, which Tim will be leading. And so there's a piece in there as well about what do we already know, what do we agree we know, and what data do we trust, and what can we share. So,
and that's so true, because the companies are proud of the information they've got, the data they've collected, but very wary. So.
Kia ora, Claire. Thank you, Taff, and thank you, Prof, for coming in today. And we can just see by using that information from CPW, actually, for the work that the studies that showed today, and that lag, actually seeing that those presentations, and actually the lag, how you worked it out. That's something I learned today. So thank you for coming in and helping us as councillors. As I said, this is, I think it was part 2 of a 4-part mini-series that will be soon to see on YouTube, ECAN YouTube. but just thanking everyone for that. I think it's I mean, that's why we're here to listen to this, and then and by the end of the presentations, look to where we go from there. But remember, tomorrow we have GCP from 9 till 12, and then Te Roputuia from 12:30 to 3:30. Look forward to seeing everyone there. We'll finish off with karakia, and then does anyone want to volunteer? Marko mai. I'll do it. Nā reira nei anō te mihi. Thank you for everyone today, and thank you for Dr. for in today, and of course Cam, and Cam. Nā reira, ka tāka nei te karakia hei whakakape, te hui nei tēnei rā unuhia. Unuhia ki te urutapa nui o tāne. Kia wāti, kia māma, te kākau, te tinana, te wairua, te arataka tā, koe rā e roko whakiriaki ki roke kia tīna, haumi huie, tāi ki. Kia ora tātou.